Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining our live class today. As always, we are super excited to be talking about elevating your real estate game. Thank you for joining me, Andrea. If you'd like to introduce yourself real quick before we get into the presentation.
Sure. I'm Andrea Aylett-Hosh with Commonwealth Trust Services, and I'm going to be telling you a little bit more about Commonwealth in just a few minutes, but I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. So disclaimer, NewView Trust serves as your custodian for alternative assets. NewView does not provide legal, tax, or investment advice. We custody IRAs, ESAs, 401ks, and hold alternative assets chosen by you, the client. So what is a self-directed IRA? As always, a self-directed IRA is an IRA in which the owner directs all of the investment choices inside of that IRA inside of a tax-free or tax-deferred environment. So Andrea, tell me a little bit about what you do and why you're here today.
Okay. Well, as I said, I'm with Commonwealth Trust Services. I am a licensed attorney, and I became an investor in the early 2010, that kind of 15 years ago, had some rental properties, that type of thing, started getting involved, learned about land trusts. So even though I had been in real estate as an attorney, I didn't really know about land trusts. So I met August Bilat, who was my partner. He was a real estate coach at the time. And he had already formed Commonwealth Trust Services because he had come from New York, where land trusts are not used at or even known of. And when he got down here, he found out what a cool tool it was to join in his investing business. So he founded the company in 2013, and I came on in 2017. And now I manage it because he's doing a lot of philanthropic things with Share the Love. So I'm also a broker owner of Pineapple Place Real Estate. Nice. So it all just kind of works in hand with being able to help our clients in how they want to structure their deals and how to use land trusts when they do that.
Absolutely. Wow, a lot of good information from you. You have a lot of experience, which is why we're so happy to have you today.
Oops. Well, I guess I'm gonna have to let Amy switch the slides for me. So I always like to start out with a question, kind of like, what do your real estate assets have in common? Right. And typically, what people say is, well, they're real property, but I really can't think of anything else. Right. But you have to think about, how are we holding those things? And we're titling them in our own name. Typically, you're holding them in your name, or your clients may be holding them in the name of their retirement account. But when you do that, they can all be, joined together. So if you want to switch maybe the next couple of slides. So we're owning them in our own name. And, when we're talking about creating wealth and building our wealth, like your clients are wanting to do, we think about privacy. Right. We want to keep those things to ourselves. We don't want it to be out there so everybody knows what our assets are. Our bank accounts are private. Our stock portfolios are private. I'm sure no one can go to the NewView website, type in somebody's name, find out what their assets are here. But with real estate, if you're familiar with how real estate becomes secured as an asset, that's all done through public record. So somebody can go to the property appraiser website, then they can go to Sunbiz, look up the company that holds the property, and it all comes together, and they can put that together. So we're trying to help people being out there as a deep pocket, because we do live in a very litigious society. So what can we do, or what if we could keep our real estate assets private, what we own private? We've got up here, you may own a retirement, you may own a rental property, you may have a Airbnb, a short-term rental, a vacation home. All of those things are things that you don't necessarily want the public to know about. I also put in a security agreement, a balloon note mortgage. That's also a recorded property interest that can be held privately in a land trust. So I know probably a lot of your account holders might be lending through their Roths, their IRAs, that type of thing. And they might be doing that, all together in the millions. And they don't want necessarily people to be able to look up those mortgages and see, excuse me, what they have out there. So Florida has created I shouldn't say Florida has created, but in Florida we have Codified, which means it's on the statutes, a land trust that functions the way we're going to talk about it today. Now, land trusts are based on revocable trust principles, which actually our country inherited from English common law. So 49 out of 50 states actually have, based their trust laws on revocable trust principles. And what that means is, even though your property is and you may be putting things in a trust, it's revocable by the person who holds the power over that. So you can always deed them back out, that type of thing. So land trusts in their essence really work in 49 of 50 states. But Florida is one of 6 states that actually has it on the laws. So it's well used in Florida because of that. In fact, Walt Disney used Florida Land Trust back in the 60s to privately amass all of his land through different buyers. And yes, because obviously if Walt Disney comes to town and starts buying things in his own name or his company's name, then the price is going to go up. So ours is, like I said, codified on Florida Statute 689-071 and 073. They're actually pretty short, very understandable statutes. So that makes it nice. It's very clear. And, oftentimes we have to educate maybe the title company that we're, that we're dealing with, or the property appraiser that's not familiar with it. So we can easily, send them to those statutes. Now in a land trust, the ownership of the property vests in the trustee for the benefit of the beneficiary. And when we talk about vesting, basically that just means somehow the ownership interest has to get to the grantee. So there's a grantor, and typically that's you if you already own property and you want to deed your property into a trust, or perhaps you're purchasing your property, you want to never have your name on public record with regard to it. So you're going to purchase it directly into the trust. So it's the grantor on the deed, directing it to the trustee. So it's vesting in the trustee.
But would you want to be your own grantor or trustee?
Well, that's a really good question. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But what we're trying to do with the land trust is to keep your assets private. Now, if you already own something, I've gotten that question lots of times, like, I already have 5 rental properties. I really wish they were in trust. Well, you can still deed them into a trust, because once they go into the trust, somebody can look on public record and say, they used to own it. Now it's in a trust. That was a few years ago. You don't know who still owns the interest now. And secondly, you cannot search by prior owner. So, what we're trying to do is keep our assets separate and private. So if you have several rental properties and something occurs, maybe a slip and fall on that property, somebody goes to an attorney, they look up that property and they say, it's in a trust. I see the prior owner was so-and-so, but they can't put in the prior owner's name and come up with things they used to own. So it doesn't work that way. So it still does add a big protection to go ahead and transfer what you own now into trust. And it also gives you some separation, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit later.
And it helps you transfer, right?
Yes. Well, it helps you privately transfer to the next person. Yes. These are, I would say probably 95% of the time, land trusts are used by investors. So it's very beneficial for another investor who comes along and says, hey, I'd like to buy that rental property. You make a deal. You can transfer it privately. It never changes title on public record. You still have a title policy that you had, ensuring the trust as the title owner. So would you just
change the beneficiary of the trust to the next buyer?
Yes. And I'm going to have a slide on that, what that paperwork entails, and a little bit further down.
All right.
But the other question I get a lot here is, well, wait a second, a trustee, if it's not me, because you don't necessarily want to be your own trustee, because if you do transfer them to trust, you have 5 rental properties, all of a sudden they're looking up that trustee. They can tell it's not a professional trustee like we are. So they're like, oh, those properties are probably related. Because you're trying to avoid looking like a deep pocket. So a lot of times people are like, well, I don't want to use a third party trustee. That makes me nervous, because then they have all the power to transfer my property. But the beneficiary is retaining complete control. They have a power of direction over the trustee. And there's some documents we're going to talk about in just a few minutes that help you secure those rights and, protect you. So once again, the most biggest benefit of a land trust is your privacy. You're going to use it to hold title to property. It's a simple and effective way, like you just brought up, to keep your name on public record and also be able to transfer property. And we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about partnerships too. It's an easier way to partner with other people without all your business being out there on public record.
Right.
I own 30%, he owns 40%, she owns 30% in her IRA, and all those things. So planning is also another big advantage. As with most trusts, your people place their property or their assets into a trust, so it can easily pass to their their heirs upon their passing. So we also obviously have that option with a land trust. Now, typically, a lot of our clients, because they are investors and they're building their portfolio through using their different companies, and they're very asset protection minded. They're going to hold their beneficial interest typically in an LLC, maybe a corporation, maybe their retirement accounts. So in those types of things, they're going to designate their beneficiaries within those documents, maybe their company documents, their beneficiary documents with their IRA. But we occasionally have people that they're already holding their rental properties in their own name, and for whatever reasons, tax strategies with their accountant, they're going to keep them in their own name. Then yes, we always say, please, don't waste this opportunity to go ahead and designate your heirs now, because something happens, then there's no heirs designated, then that property would still have to go through probate, and we're trying to avoid costs and just extra hassle. The other thing, that big benefit of a land trust, is keeping those properties, as I mentioned before, separate from one another. So your LLC, say 123 LLC, has 5 rental properties. You can place them all in separate trusts, which is what we recommend. Usually we recommend that it goes by the property address, because that's what the majority, I would say over 90% of investors in Florida are going to title their property that way, because it keeps it unique, so that it's actually separately titled, but it's not unique in the fact that everybody's doing it that way. So we can't associate your property address properties with somebody else's, because everybody's naming their properties that way. But as we are creating our, building our wealth and running our businesses and doing deals, we're also living our life, and things can happen. So most of us might have kids, you might have houses, you have things that are happening that maybe you get sued, maybe there's a judgment against you, or maybe there's a judgment against your property. So when the property is titled separately and a judgment comes against that property, that's not going to affect you personally as you're living your life. Exactly. Or any of your other properties. So I have people always say, well, can't I put all of my properties in one trust? Well, you're giving up a couple things then. You're giving up your disassociation. So your privacy, in other words, that trust now looks like a deep pocket, because it has 5 properties titled in it. And secondly, any judgment that comes against one, or any code, sometimes we're doing flips and we're also having rental properties. So if you have a really rough client or tenant and keep getting code liens, you're trying to sell your rental, your flip over here to generate some cash that you need, all of a sudden you're at a standstill, because you've got a code lien violation against your property that's held in the same LLC that you're doing your flip in.
So then you can't touch those other properties while you have that code lien on. Correct?
Exactly. So protection that way, and also the trustee. So anything that would come against the trustee, as say, occasionally the trustee company gets sued because of the things, all the different properties, that's not going to affect all the uniquely titled properties. So it's really gives you that separation, which is helpful. So we're going to talk about some of the players. The most important player in a land trust is the beneficiary, because that's the person that, like your clients, and they're the ones that have to want the trust. So the way it works with us is they go to our website, they order a trust, and they're obviously wanting us to be the trustee. And that's the only other absolutely necessary player. To have a trust, you've got to have a beneficiary and you have to have a trustee. And like we've already talked about, I recommend that you have a third-party trustee. It doesn't have to be necessarily a professional trustee like we are, but you do have to make sure that they're knowledgeable, this person, they're available. In other words, if you want Uncle Bob to be your trustee on your properties, well, number one, it's going to be able to be seen that he is only a trustee on 5 properties. He's not a trustee. He's not a third party professional trustee that's out there and that's what they're doing, or he's not an attorney that does that as part of their business, and also is Uncle Bob going to be available to sign sale documents or to deal with something that comes up, or is he going to be vacationing? So those are the kinds of things you have to think about. A director is an optional participant. All of our trust agreements provide for the option of appointing a director. Typically, we see only a director only appointed when there's multiple beneficiaries. So a lot of times we might have 3 or 4 beneficiaries. Maybe we have a couple that are really just the money partners. They don't really want to be involved in the day-to-day things. They don't want to be, bothered necessarily when, we need to have a permit signed or that type of thing. Because as I'm going to talk about in a minute, we only take substantive action as a trustee when we have written direction. So it makes it easier for us too. If there's 4 or 5 beneficiaries, if we can just connect with one and say, hey, do we have direction to go ahead and sign this listing agreement, or go ahead and sign this application for a new roof, those types of things. Property manager, we give each of our beneficiaries a property management agreement, either in the name of their company or their name, whichever they prefer, just so they can be dealing with the property, setting up power, water, dealing with the tenant as a leasing agent, that type of thing. Or they might designate a third party property manager, and then we would sign that agreement. Then the successor beneficiary, I just talked about that a minute ago. That's going to be those heirs that you're going to name if you need to do that. Now, the paperwork is also very important. So just to recap that last, for a Florida land trust, you only need a trustee and a beneficiary. For the paperwork to make it a valid trust, you need that deed to trustee that we talked about in the beginning, which vests the ownership in the trustee. And the other thing that you need per Florida statutes is a written land trust agreement. The land trust agreement is going to be the protection for each, the trustee and the beneficiary, as to their roles, responsibilities, that type of thing. Now, on public record in the deed, we're going to have all the power to protect, conserve, preserve, and transfer that property. So what the land trust agreement does is it gives all that power back to the beneficiary and says, yes, the trustee has all the power on public record. That's what keeps me private, my name private, but I'm really behind the curtain, like Oz, like, doing the
pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Exactly. So that's the beneficiary. Then of course the warranty deed to trustee, I just talked about that. We're going to need that. That's recorded instrument, which is why everything with property is visible, because there has to be a recorded instrument to protect everybody. You might say, oh, I'm going to buy this property, but unless somebody records a deed, you don't have any public claim to that property. Now, the thing that you asked earlier about transferring it privately, this is the next piece of paperwork. It's not required. You don't have to have an assignment, because you might be purchasing your property directly into trust. So you've got a deed, you've got a land trust agreement. That's all you have in your trust. But if the next thing you're going to do is transfer that ownership to someone else, then there's going to be an assignment of beneficial interest. Now, this form is probably, this assignment document is probably used in, I would say, 80% of our trusts, because it's a great tool that people want to use when they're structuring certain deals. I don't know if you've ever heard of buying a property subject to the mortgage. That's very popular with investors. That's when the mortgage that the seller or the owner right now has is going to stay in place, and the buyer is still going to purchase that property, and that's going to be like an exception to the title policy. And that new buyer is going to take over the payments on that mortgage, even though it doesn't have their name on it. They're not assuming it, but they're just going to take it over. So the land trust, that is in probably 99% of mortgages, that's going to violate the due on sale clause. But mortgage companies don't have to call the loan, and a lot of them don't want to because they want performing assets. But in order that it's not a kind of a red flag on public record, what investors will do is the seller, and a lot of our investors and your clients, they're dealing directly with sellers. So they're going to say, hey, Mr. Seller, if you place your property into trust, establish the trust, you become the settler of the trust, then at closing, you'll transfer me the beneficial interest. That's unrecorded. So it's a private transfer, and doc stamps are still due. So the state of Florida requires documentary stamps to be paid on every transfer where control is changed. Now, when you're transferring your own property into trust, you're not changing control. That's done for estate planning purposes, and that's fine, and doc stamps aren't due. But anyway, obviously the state of Florida realized, hey, there's a lot of unrecorded transfers being doing, and we need to be able to collect those doc stamps. So they created a form, a DR 228, that is used on a regular basis with the title companies we deal with. And that form takes the doc stamps from unrecorded transfers, and they send them right to the Department of Revenue in Tallahassee. And the reason that's important is because your sale price gets recorded at the county level. And the way the county knows what sale price is because they collect the doc stamps. They get the doc stamps, they extrapolate that back, and they say, oh, this is what it sold for based on the doc stamps that we've got. So a lot of sellers, they don't want their neighbors and their friends and their relatives to know what they're selling their, the purchase price or the sale price of their property. And especially a lot of times if it's a probate situation, the example that I put up here, we've circled it. This was some investors that actually spoke directly, had written a letter to this seller and said, hey, we'd like to, we see that this is a probate situation. She reached out and she's like, yeah, I really don't want my family to know what the sale price is. So she became the settler of the trust. And then there was a private assignment, and that's what the doc stamps, look like. It just records $100. So that's a very popular thing to do. Now, we also, as I said earlier, we're going to provide a management agreement for all of our clients. That is really just a formality between us and them for the public's benefit. So the public knows that they're like, oh, why is this person dealing with that property? They don't want to say, well, I really am the beneficiary. I own that property. No, they just want to say, oh, I'm managing this on behalf of the trust. So of course the beneficiary holds all the direction to control us anyway, but we do provide, a management agreement that gives them the power for the public. So if they go to, especially water companies seem to be the most demanding to know, how do you have the right to set up water on this property? So there's 3 common ways to place your property into trust. We've talked about the first couple already, but deeding a property that you already own into a land trust. The second one is purchasing your property directly into a trust. Now, this is when we have a lot of repeat investors doing this. They're buying rental properties, they're buying flip properties on a regular basis, and they don't even want their names on the contract anymore. So they write the contract in the name of a trust, in the name of, usually it's Commonwealth Trust Services, LLC, as trustee of the whatever the property address is, land trust, and they'll actually send it to us, usually by DocuSign these days, and we sign it. They make the offer, the seller signs it, and
so easy these days.
So easy. They're still providing, some proof of funds typically to the seller to show that, they have the cash and that type of thing. But that, if you could go back to that slide for just a second. The third way down at the bottom is the one I talked about a minute ago, where you could set up the land trust with the seller as the initial, the one that's going to place it into trust, and then transfer it to the end buyer. So that's not only done in subject to, I just wanted to bring that's also done when people just want to protect their purchase price. But it works well with subject to deals because we don't want that red flag of a transfer. That when a subject to deal is done and that's somebody transfers their property into trust and the mortgage is still there, it just looks like they're doing it for estate planning purposes. They can't see that next step of the assignment. That's private. So safety in lending to a land trust. I wanted to talk about this because, like I said, I know a lot of your clients may be either lending to a trust or maybe they're purchasing properties into a trust and then attracting lenders. So there's a lot of good elements in when you do that, when you borrow in a trust or lend to a trust. And the main thing there is things we've already talked about. That property is going to be sort of insulated, right? It's kind of in a little snow globe on its own. So if as a lender, you're lending to someone who is got their property in trust, you can know, okay, nothing that this guy is doing, or if his kids get in a car accident and he gets sued, that's not going to affect the trust property that I'm lending on. Now, of course, the trustee is going to be signing the note and the mortgage because we're the title owner. But typically, lenders are also going to have that underlying borrower sign a personal guarantee, just like if they were borrowing in their name of their LLC. So I think we can switch to the next slide. So seller financing is also a great way. I know people will purchase their properties maybe in their IRA or their Roth account. Yeah. And I bought a property from a partner and I did from someone had bought a rental property in their IRA. And then they just, after a few years, they were retired and they're like, oh, this is kind of a lot of work. We're going to sell it. But they sold it on seller financing. So that's a nice tool, a free and clear property. You're selling it to a purchaser who's buying it in a trust. So all those same things apply. You can feel secure in that property is not going to be mixed in with this person's other assets, being an LLC where there, or other things are going on. And I just wanted to also mention wrap financing. So if you do have a property and rental property and you have some financing on it, and you're like, I'd like to sell it, but I have a really good underlying financing and I'd like to keep that and make a spread on it. So we'll have a lot of investors that will either they'll place that particular property will go into a trust and then they'll assign the beneficial interest to, as a sale to the end buyer. They'll keep it in the trust so that they have, that control, and then they become the lender. Either their IRA is the lender now or their LLC, and they're wrapping that underlying financing. So they're extending seller financing, but they're leaving that mortgage in place. Say you've got financing for 3%, you're going to lend at 8%. So you're going to make that spread 5%. And you're going to get a chunk up front for their down payment, that type of thing. So nice. So that's commonly done. I left contract for deed in there because I get asked about contracts for deed a lot. And that is when the seller, basically you're selling your property on an installment sale, but you're keeping that deed. So you're thinking, okay, I'm not going to give you the deed until you pay me off. And that used to be pretty popular in Florida. People still do it, but it's not as effective. And the reason people did it was they didn't want to have to foreclose, right? So they're like, I'm going to keep the deed. And that way, if you don't pay me 5 years, you stop paying, I don't have to foreclose. I just don't give you the deed. But realistically, it doesn't really work that way because on public record, when the county gets a contract for deed and it gets recorded, they actually change the ownership to that person who's on the contract for deed. So that person now has a title interest and an equitable interest. And if that person doesn't relinquish the property to you, even though they don't have the deed, you're going to have to foreclose. So a more effective tool is when you have it in the trust, you can actually, I think I have a slide a little bit later about this, but a collateral assignment of beneficial interest. So say you're holding the financing, the property's in trust, you've transferred the beneficial interest. You're also going to have them sign a collateral assignment saying, hey, I now hold the beneficiary interest. I bought it from you. You're the owner. But I'm going to sign this document that says I'm giving you my interest as collateral. And if I default, it's connected. It outlines the note. If I default, then the trustee is directed by this document here to revert the interest back to you. So that's much more effective than a contract for deed.
And safer.
Yes. So that actually, we have a lot of clients that utilize that for seller financing. I have some hard money lenders also that they don't close anything unless they have a collateral assignment. And I did want to mention too, probably should have mentioned this earlier on, but you can do a land trust with your homestead.
Okay.
But what the principles we're talking about here are really for investors that are not going to be living on the property.
Right.
Okay. You're not going to be lending to people that are going to be living in the property, because that comes with a whole different set of rules that we're not going to get into today.
Right.
But there's more lending rules with Dodd-Frank and those types of
Yeah.
things. So you want to stick with lending to somebody on commercial loans that's going to be flipping that property. They're going to have renters. They're treating it as a business. So land trusts also make it great to do lease options. A lot of times you'll have we have investors that are going to purchase a property. You know, they're going to purchase a property, but they're going to do it down the road.
Okay.
So they're going to pay on a lease for a little while, and they're going to purchase an option to purchase that. So they'll give the seller maybe $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 to be able to have the option to buy a property at this set price that they're agreeing to today, but within 3 years. So the nice thing about that is the seller will be like, okay, well, I'll give you a lease from my company for this property. And then the trustee, because it's in trust, they're going to give you the option. And the reason that's important is we want to stay away from it looking like seller financing.
Right.
Because the minute it looks like seller financing, then you might be in the, even though they don't execute the option correctly, maybe they don't pay on time, those types of things. If you don't bifurcate the lease and the option, then, you might have to foreclose them to get them to relinquish control of the property. But the other thing about lease options when it's in a trust is if the person is, doing the option with the trust, there's a lot of protections that the person owning the trust is not going to be able to put additional financing on it, which is nice. And then the person that has the option is also going to be held to some, just some different kinds of rules and restrictions. So that works well. So what's in the paperwork for lending? Obviously, you're going to have a note and mortgage. The note is the promise to pay. So that's typically the note is going to set out all the the interest rate, the terms of the installment terms, what the total amount is of the loan, and all the other things, what could cause a default. That is typically unrecorded. That's because you don't necessarily want your terms to be all over public record. Now, attorneys that write notes and mortgages will do it that way. They'll do a separate note and then a separate mortgage to keep those terms separate. A lot of title companies, they have a form called a mortgage note, and then they'll just kind of fill in the forms. That'll get recorded and everything will be on public record. But the next thing is what secures your right to that property as a lender and your priority of lien, and that's the mortgage. So that's the security interest. And that's what can also, because it's a recorded security interest, can go into a land trust. So like I talked at the beginning, if you have lenders, they're like, wow, I'm really doing a lot of lending here. I'm getting a lot on public record, a lot of mortgages. They might want to consider lending through a land trust. We have a lot of investors that it's the, 123 Main Street Lending Trust, and nobody can tell who that underlying lender is. So that works really well. And the other thing that works well with that is maybe you have, somebody needs $500,000. I'm like, well, I have couple hundred. I'd really like, this sounds like a really good deal, but I don't have enough to make up the whole mortgage. You can bring in partners to make up the lending trust. So I actually work with some lenders that's how they do every trust. They put together a lending trust, for their loans.
For each loan individual?
Yeah, not
separate?
For, no, like that when they're doing a package, let's say they're loaning, $500,000 and they're going to have 4 or 5 investors, or even it can even be a smaller amount. Sometimes it's, 100,000, and you've got I know when my account started out, I had a little bit, and I was always thinking, what can I do with that little bit? We've had clients that have built up their children's Roths and HSAs by them becoming part of a land trust in a very small percentage. Now one client that we had, I think he had 2 daughters, one with an HSA and one with a Roth, and he put them on 5% each time he purchased a property and did a flip. and then slowly build their accounts up. So you could also
That's
do
great.
that with loaning as well. And like I talked about earlier in the beginning, there might be a slide on it, but it really gives you more secure ways to do partnerships. And you also might want a partnership in a rental property. You know, maybe there's going to be two investors. Now, remember, the investors together make up the beneficiary interest, and they have the power of control to direct the trustee. So they need to be unanimous in what they're telling us to do, or we don't have clear direction. So a lot of times we'll recommend, hey, why don't you do a beneficiary agreement? And that's kind of like a joint venture agreement. So it sets out the rules of their partnership, what they're agreeing to now. And then they give that to us. We accept it. We sign off on it. And that way down a year or so, when one of the partners was like, well, I want to do it this way. And the other partner's like, nah, I don't think so. We look at the beneficiary agreement. It's like, well, this is what you agreed to. So this is, what we have to go by. Right. So interest rate, I just took a slide in here. So I don't know how many, out of state, lenders or clients you might have, but the interest rate in Florida is 18% is the maximum that you can of annualized 18% that you can lend at. So you want to make sure that you're careful even when you're charging points and charging a monthly interest rate, that it all works together to not be more than 18% annualized. Financing and operating your property in a land trust. That's something I always like to mention, because if you want to go to the next slide, there's protections that we've already talked about, like the trustee is going to sign the note and mortgage. That's really important to a borrower, because, think of the borrowers that are doing multiple flips. We have some that are purchasing 2 properties a month, and they're getting private lender loans. And if their name was out there on public record with all those, and then they go to buy a home loan and somebody looks them up and they're like, whoa, what have you got going on here? So it keeps, even though a lot of those might have been paid off, but it keeps their credit clear of those multiple encumbrances. And then, of course, we've already talked about the lender assets not being on public record, either when they're lending through a trust or lending to or purchasing their assets within the trust, their real estate interests. Ease and privacy of partnerships, that is really key. And I just went over that a minute ago, but I also want to point out that if you're, this is just like an example that people like, oh, I didn't really think about that. But if you get into a loan situation and you've partnered with somebody, and, like I said, maybe you put in 200,000, they put in 300,000, and a year down the road, you're like, wow, I really need that cash back. You could go out and find somebody to buy your portion of the note. And that would be much easier, because you're just assigning them part of your trust. It can also work with a property. Obviously, if you own a rental property with someone, then, and you need to get out of it. They don't want to get out of it, because I will say you cannot do a partition in a land trust. I mean, the land trust is, there's no partition action. That's prohibited by statute. So you can't force the other beneficiary in there to sell it. But they can sell their interest. And that's also where beneficiary agreement comes in key, because you might not want to be partners with just anybody. So we might set up ahead of time, hey, it's okay if one of us want to sell our interest, as long as the other person gets the option to buy that interest first, or we get to approve the next partner. But it still makes it a lot easier than having all those documents. Just think if you had the note, you had the mortgage out there on public record as 50, 40, 60%, then you've got to change documents. You have to do a lot more things than you do by just changing the beneficial interest through an assignment. Let's see. Personal guarantees. We've talked about that. The collateral assignment. I knew I had a slide that brought that up. So that's really important. And the other thing, we call it a little bit different, call it a contingent assignment of beneficial interest. But when a seller sells a property subject to, their biggest thing is, what happens if they don't pay? And, my credit's on the line with this mortgage. So we'll make basically the assignment is assignment back to them, but it's contingent on the buyer, the new buyer, not paying their underlying mortgage. So it's just a little bit different wording, but basically the same thing. There are in the overall theme of that is that there are ways within the trust to protect those kinds of things, to protect your ability to be able to get that property back if the person, either through lending or through taking over payments, doesn't meet their obligation. But they are additional documents that you have to put in place and you have to know about. And that's another reason why you want to make sure you use a knowledgeable trustee. Equity participation. So that's another advantage for lenders. A lot of times we'll have someone that is, they're kind of in the retirement phase, but they've really done a lot of flips, had rental properties, and they want to, loan to a new person, somebody they've maybe met at a meeting and sounds like, just getting started. But they're like, I really want some control. So I'm going to be an equity participant in the trust. I'm going to have I'm going to have a note mortgage, but I'm also going to be a 20% owner. So those are, different ways that you can set it up. Directorship. They also might want to be a director. If they're, lending to somebody who's a newbie, instead of being the actual, equity participant, they want to be like, I'm going to direct the trust. This is this guy's first deal, and make sure that,
everything goes good and smooth.
Yeah. Obtaining insurance. I always like to talk about this at the end, just so people realize that, land trust is a good protective device in a lot of ways. Privacy, in lending, in like the other things we've talked about, judgment liens, but it's not going to help you if your property burns down. So you've got to have that hazard insurance. You've got to have that liability insurance in case somebody gets hurt on your property. And if you're lending to a property, whether you're lending to somebody and it's not in a trust or it is in a trust, you want to make sure that you're an additional insured on that policy. Also, when you're setting up insurance and the property is titled in the trust, then the way it's titled, now with us, it would be Commonwealth Trust Services, LLC as trustee, is going to be the title insured for that, because the insurance runs with the deed. A lot of people are like, well, I want my beneficiary company to be the insured. Well, you don't need to be, and you're not on the deed. So you could tell the insurance company to do it that way, but then when it comes time to actually pay a claim, you're probably going to have some issues. So they're going to be like, oh, well, wait a second. You're not the title owner. We can't pay you on this claim, even though they set it up that way. So that's something that we help people with. We educate people a lot on that and how to get their insurance set up correctly. We work with some really good insurance people that have been routinely loaning to, insuring our clients. Yes. Multiple properties. I've already touched on this, but a lot of people are like, can't we just use one trust and put our properties in it? But as we've already talked about, it's really best to have the separate land trust. Yes, that's the way this type of thing works best. The judgments are going to not impact each other and not impact you against the trust, or the trust against you personally or your company. And it's also, yes, if you have several properties in a trust, and then you want to do an option agreement for one of the properties, it just becomes a little messy. It's a little hard to separate that out. It can be done, but it takes a little bit extra documents. And sometimes it also confuses the title companies when they're trying to close something. They're like, this is this land trust. Now, what properties does it have in it? And what does it look like on public record?
If the title company's getting confused, probably as the investor, you're getting confused.
Yeah. So considering a trustee, you want to make sure, obviously, they're trustworthy. They understand fiduciary duty, because we have a fiduciary duty to our client. And what that means, it's a high level duty up here that is saying something has been put in your possession with the utmost of care. And there's also specific statutory guidelines that we have to obey. So whoever acts as your trustee needs to understand that, and understand that, hey, they just don't have a property that they can do whatever they want with now. And they have to be available when you need them. And if somebody calls and says, hey, who really owns this property? Or they have to know what to say and where to direct them, and that type of thing. Discretion, there we go. And can they meet your needs, like the availability? So lenders, borrowers, buyers sleep more soundly when they purchase their properties, when they lend to land trusts, and even lend through a land trust.
Definitely. I know a lot of times we have clients asking me, oh, but when I'm purchasing this property, I don't want it to be titled as New View Trust Company, FBO Tabitha Choma. I want it titled under my LLC, or I want it titled under something else. So this is a really great tool to utilize when you want to stay anonymous when you're making investments. And
exactly,
like you mentioned, keeping yourself protected. Now, my question is, what benefits would it be to have an LLC as the trustee? I know I had heard something.
You mean
about
as the beneficiary?
That. Maybe as the beneficiary.
Yes. So yes, we always talk to people about if they're calling up, and I know they're investors. I'm having a conversation with them, understanding they're trying to build their business, and I say, well, how are you holding your interest now? Well, I'm holding my own name. I'll kind of discuss with them, well, why are you holding it in your own name?
Right.
Because there's some complications with that. Just like your property gets sued, you get sued personally. And an LLC offers that underlying asset protection. So the land trust is set up for the privacy so that when people search you, they can't tell what kind of assets you have. And if something happens on that property, the land trust is going to be sued, not you personally. However, if say something catastrophic happens on your property and it's over and above the insurance that you're going to have, and some people even have an umbrella policy. So this has never happened, but if it did, then they're going to bear the trust and they're going to see what is that underlying asset. And if it's you personally, then they're going to look at the asset and what that underlying asset structure, what assets it has. Now, if it's an LLC, there's a lot of protections with having an LLC as the beneficiary, because they can only get a charging order against the profit distributions of an LLC. And maybe that LLC is not going to distribute profits. So you have a lot more options than if you hold it in your personal name. So, and I know holding it in a retirement account also, there's a lot of benefits to that too.
A lot of benefits. Yeah, even though the retirement account is a protected entity, some people like to, have their investments in the LLC underneath. So I think having it in the trust will just add another layer of protection, keep all of their assets protected, especially when you're keeping them separate. That's what I love about what you said the most, when you're having your investments in a singular LLC, and if something happens to this property over here is protected because it's in a different trust.
Right. And you can continue to deal with that property, because say you do have quite a lawsuit going on with this one property, and their beneficiary structure is the same LLC. You're like, I might need some cash. So you can still sell this property while that lawsuit's going on, and generate the asset, the cash that you need, or whatever it is that you need to do.
Whereas opposed, if it was all in one trust and something was going on with a code lien over here at this property, and you were looking to sell this property, you can't. You're kind of stuck where you're at.
You got it.
So really great information. Thank you so much for taking your time and explaining everything to us. I know I learned a lot. I know Amy learned a lot.
I think we have a slide too coming up. This is just going through what we provide. We provide consulting, corporate trustee services, document preparation. Obviously, I'm an attorney, so I'll also do some documents for private money lenders and hard money lenders, and other things for borrowers like leases. We do closing coordination and recording of documents. We also offer that service if people are placing their own properties into trust. Obviously, we're going to accept the service of process on the properties that we hold in trust. So, just to recap, you're going to have a lot of benefits with placing your property in trust. You're going to have privacy. Some instances, you're going to get your sale price hidden. Transfers of ownership are private, unrecorded. You have some lien protection, avoidance of probate, safer partnerships. It's attractive to lenders, and you avoid partition and safe structure of lease options and subject to deals. And then last but not least is our website. Our website has a lot of information on it. It's commonwealthlandtrust.com. You can also get to it by going to yourlandtrust.com. You can also email us at admin@commonwealthlandtrust.com, and then that's our phone number. So if any of your clients ever need anything with regard to trusts or just a consult, we'd be happy to help them.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure if anybody needs you, feel free to reach out to Andrea. And if you're looking to move forward with NewView Trust and start investing in alternative assets and unlocking the power of your future, you can scan this QR code and see our easy steps to get started. It'll scan the QR code to set up an appointment with one of our wonderful IRA specialists like me. Fill out an application and we'll get your goals going. We have AltCon coming up in October 17th and 18th that we're super excited about. If you're looking for a $50 off coupon, please use this QR code and the promo code down there at the bottom to get a good $50 off of your registration. And if you're looking to stay up to date with NewView, please scan this other QR code and get in touch with us in any of our social media channels, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, all of the above nowadays. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.